This is the Inkpulp podcast. This is the Inkpulp podcast. Comics, hip hop, life. Welcome to the Inkpulp podcast. Again, I'm your host, Sean Crystal. Today we're going to do a little tool talk. This is part of my, like an introduction to my upcoming Inkpulp Instruction video series, which is going to teach all of you interested young, developing artists how to draw all different areas of comics. It's going to be a large library. Myself, I'm going to make a bunch of videos, but I'm also going to have everyone I can and everyone I know in the industry do one, with maybe 100 to 200 videos in the end. We'll round out the library, offering you a full academic experience in the learning of art, or the learning of comic book art. Other areas too, I'm sure I'll branch out. That will all be available in the future. The first one is coming soon. I'm gonna have my crowdfunding campaign launch on September 1st for the first video. So part of all those videos will be an element of tool talk. Today, because the first video I'm doing focuses on line. What is line as applied to inking, how to use it, some very very basic theories, some very basic techniques, some very basic tools. So because of that, the tools that I focus on mainly in the video are pigment pens. And I do step into the brush a bit, but my rendering video is going to step deeper into the brush, and that's going to come probably early 2021, that video. But I've got videos planned for 2020. I've got 6 of them planned. I'm doing one. That means 5 other creators. All right. So today I want to review and kind of demonstrate some different pigment pens and brush pens. And when I say brush pen, there's 2 types. There are brush pens that are actual brushes that have several hairs, synthetic hairs, that act like a real brush. And then there's brush pens that are a single fiber, a flexible, mushy, fibrous tip. That's what I'm going to cover today. So the pens I'm going to talk to you about are, first we're going to start with Micron. Let me try to get a good focus on that. There we go. This is a Micron 08. I'm going to use that guy. And here's a Micron 01. I'm going to use that guy too. And I'm going to contrast them to the Prismacolor pigment pen. This is the Prismacolor 08, and of course there you go, Prismacolor 01. Alright, so I'm going to do those. I also am going to try out this new thing. Sharpie has a line, there it is, Sharpie has a line of pens and brush pens that aren't alcohol based. Yeah, no, they're pigment based. They're waterproof, archival ink. So I want to give those a run. So that was the Sharpie pen. And then I have this cool little box, nice little traveling case of what's called a Sharpie brush pen. And when you open it up, it's got this little plastic thing here. It says store horizontally, which is wonderful. I wonder how problematic it is if you don't store them horizontally. So this looks just like, let me try to get a good focus. There you go. Looks just like the Sharpie pen, but if you look at the tip of the original Sharpie pen, it's a pigment pen, whereas this guy right here is a brush tip. So we'll see how that goes today. Curiouser and curiouser. I'm also gonna step into these Tombow dual brush pens. I have a little experience with them. But what's neat about these are water-based, so they're not waterproof. They're dual tips, so you've got a brush on one side, a big fat brush, and you've got a brush on the other, like a regular pen tip on the other side. These I became very familiar with. I'll talk about that when I start to mess with them. But they also come with this colorless blender. Ooh, what's that gonna do? I don't know. We'll check it out. So I believe, yeah, that's all the tools I'm gonna cover. So I'm gonna head over to my art table, and I'm gonna start messing with these and filming it for you. So come on with me. Let's go check it out. All right, so I've got my little setup here. I'm going to start with the 08s, the Micron and the Prismacolor, to see what they're all about. So what I'm going to do is just try to deal with some feathering mark making at first. These are big blunt tips, the 08s, so they're not going to be the prettiest of feathers, but they'll give me a sense of the range of flexibility of the tip. Alright, so there's no bleeding, which is what we want with a pigment pen. Everything looks pretty good. It's a big, let's just do a few dead lines. Building it. I'm using a semi-smooth surface, so it's not terribly rough. And then I want to also do a fill in the black area, and we'll see how the blacks line up next to each other. And we will also see how they handle white ink on top, which is another important aspect of what we do with comic book inking. So the tip is very fresh, the ink is flowing really smoothly, really densely. And I'm familiar enough with Microns to really know that I enjoy their ink quite a bit. So let's test that versus the Micron, the Prismacolor 08. We'll start with the same sort of marks. Already, I like this Prismacolor tip better on the 08. It has a slight taper to it, so it's not as clumsy as that Micron felt, which felt like a big blunt object. This has a slight taper to the tip, which feels a little better. So the feathering looks a little prettier. Again, there's no bleeding. Let's do these same marks. And from what I can tell so far, the ink in the Micron is a denser black. And honestly, I don't know that there's a better pen ink on the market. If memory serves me, I think Zig makes a very, very good pigment pen ink. But yeah, so the ink on the Prismacolor isn't as dense, but I do like the shape of the tip a little better. But I don't think you can beat the black on the Microns. So that's my assessment of the 08s. Alright, now we're going to mess with the 01s. I'll start with the Micron again. I'm going to make the same sort of marks, but these are much finer tips, so they're going to be much finer marks. But here, this is the beauty of what I think a Micron is great with. is you can vary your pressure and get these nice tapered feathering marks, and they're very crisp. I've seen people fool the eye and make it look like a brush made the feathering marks. But really sharp. The tip has a slight taper to it, which gives it like a little bit of a point, which I enjoy. You have to be much more delicate with these tips, especially on the Microns. We'll see how the Prismacolors are, because if you go back and forth a lot, you are going to shred the tip a good bit. I'm not going to do a giant area here because these smaller tips are so delicate. I tend to dance on the top of the paper a little more and make the marks in one direction as opposed to back and forth. I know it looks like I'm going back and forth, but I'm not. I'm making the mark, pulling towards me, letting up, and then making the mark, pulling back towards me again. So that's the Micron. And let's test this against the Prismacolor. I'm curious here. This tip feels not nearly as delicate as the Micron, which is kind of nice. It's a little sturdier, which makes it a little easier to control. Very precise, no bleeding on either of these inks. Yeah, I mean, looking at it, it looks like the Micron, because it's a little bit more of a delicate tip, allows you to stay a little finer with the types of mark making I'm doing. But even with this tip, I am not going to go back and forth. These little O1s are very, very delicate. All right. So when working this small, or with a pen this small, the ink in the Micron is still a denser black, but yeah, it's the same. Yeah, it's just I don't think you can beat the Micron ink. I do like the Prismacolor tips, the shape and the material. They are kind of sturdy, but I don't think the ink density of black is nearly as good as the Microns. The Prismacolor tips are sturdy and good. So that's the O1 test. Alright, so here we go with the Sharpie pens is what we're going to try. I want to try to show you something on these. It's a little hard to read. No, it's not going to work for me. But the pen itself has at the bottom a little ribbon around it, and this one says fine. The color one's a little easier to read because the color against the black stands out. This is like a dark gray, and this one says brush. So they are labeled. They're not labeled on the tips like the other pens. But let's try these guys out. I've never used a Sharpie pen, so this is fine. They're not going with the precision numbering of 01, 02, 03, blah, blah, blah. This follows more along the line of the Faber-Castell Pitt pens, which are also a personal favorite of mine, where you have a fine labeling. And I don't know about Sharpie, but I know Pitt has the super fine. I think they have a super fine, extra fine, fine, and medium, and brush, I think, are their degrees. So I don't know what Sharpie has, but let's see what this fine guy does. This is probably similar to like a 03, maybe, Micron. And again, this is not the typical Sharpie alcohol-based ink. This is a pigment pen. This is a waterproof. I'll double check on that as soon as I'm done on the packaging. But from what I understand, this is a waterproof archival ink. So the feathering is kind of nice on this guy. It's a sturdy tip. It's not as sturdy as the Micron or the Prismacolor, but it's nice. And I don't know the durability of all these tips, like how long they last. That would have to be a different video with a lot of inking going on. All right. So looking at it now, the black ink is much better in the Sharpie pen than the Prismacolor. It's not as strong as the Micron though. As I sit here and it dries, I can see it fading a touch. You can't beat the black of that Micron. Let's see how this Sharpie brush pen works. Now, typically I don't love these types of brush pens because they die out so fast. So I don't know about the durability of this guy. But these are more typical marks of like a brush pen. And like I said, Faber-Castell is kind of the champion on this. There's some Japanese ones like Tombow makes that are smaller that I enjoy. So, I don't know, let's see how the flexibility test works. I mean, for a brush marker, that's a pretty impressive range of diversity in line. I don't know after using it for a couple hours if you'll be able to maintain that sort of thinness if just using it. I just don't know how durable it'll be over time. But it's a pretty good brush pen. It's right now it's kind of similar to the Pit. Now I am seeing a touch, and I mean I'm talking a super fine amount of bleeding with the Sharpie pens, and I can look over here and see the ink dried much slower, and just by making these marks I created some marks over there. So I'm not thrilled with the Sharpie ink so far. Micron ink dries very fast. Faber-Castell ink dries very fast. But I am impressed to some degree. I didn't expect Sharpie to step into this market with these types of tools. So for just putting their toes in the pool, I think they're doing pretty good. Like I said, the durability is going to be a big test. I know Microns intimately because I used to ink with them so much, and they are workhorses. So that's the Sharpie brush pen. Alright, now we're going to get into the Tombow dual, I call it brush pen, but it's a dual tip. They are called dual brush pens. Alright, so I'm familiar with these a little bit. They're water-based, so they're not waterproof, which is the main issue I have with them. I know that Darwin Cook, when he was alive and creating, had an affinity for these pens. I also know he liked the Faber-Castell Pit brush pens. But I don't like to use water-based tools that aren't waterproof because I like the ability of using white over it. So I'm just going to build some color. I'm really interested in this blender that I have. And like all water-based tools, you can see the marks laid down on top of each other. And you can see some variety. I will say this, for a water-based marker as opposed to alcohol, it's blending fairly smoothly as it dries. The benefit of the alcohol-based marker is you get that superior blending. So now if I come in with this orange, and you can see because these are water-based, you can see some of the streaking pulling down into it, which kind of helps blend it. I don't know. I don't love these types of markers, but let's see how the blending goes. What it's doing is picking up a lot of the pigment, and it is blending it a bit, but It's pretty interesting. I don't know. I don't love this way of working so much. Let's see if we can blend out. You can see there's some of the red left in the blender from before. So with practice, I think you could probably achieve some interesting techniques. And then as I get down, it is cool how it kind of picks up some of the ink as you blend. So that's pretty neat. So my guess is there's some sort of chemical in it. It's not just a wet water tip, but there's a chemical that sort of like removes the ink or lifts the ink. I don't know. It's okay. I mean, this isn't something I would normally use. I am curious, like maybe do a full color piece and see what it's like. While I have you here, I did want to revisit the Sharpie brush pen. I mean the Sharpie pens. Won't bleed through paper. Quick drying. Durable fine tip. Fade and water resistant ink. So I was right. It's archival, well, fade resistant and waterproof. So I want to do a little bit of a white test and then we'll call it a day. So that's the Tombow dual brush pen. Alright, let's do a little water and a little white test. First thing I'm going to do, that's what these blocks are for, is just hit the ink with some water and see if I push it around a little, do we get any bleeding? And it would appear that no, the Micron ink does not bleed, which is great. Now let's see how white lays on top of it. Okay, let me just get a little more thickness on that. Let's try to do some thin lines. Alright, so that would be our Micron. And upon reviewing it, now that the water's dry, it appears that we got very little to no bleeding from the water, and the white appears to sit on top of it very nicely. Alright, let's move on up to the Prismacolor ink. First test is the water test. Now this is not as black, this ink. So, it appears as though it is as waterproof as the other ink. I think the Micron ink, we got a little tiny bit of the ink mixed with the water. Just a touch. And maybe here we got a touch less. And that's because the ink isn't as dense, I would guess. Let's just hit it with some white now and see how that goes. A little bit too much water in my brush. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that'll work. Alright, we'll try some fine white lines too. So, because the ink isn't as dense black as the other, the white doesn't pop as much on top of it, but it works pretty good. One thing I am noticing is right in here where the water was placed on top of the black. I mean, it could just be that it's still a little wet. Yeah, it's just still a little wet. It's fine. So if I come back down to the Micron bit, I want to point something out. There's a little, like a barely darker value than the white paper where some of the ink came through. So it's a tiny little bleed. Now this dried for about an hour, I should say. This is after about an hour of drying. Now the Prismacolor, you get none of that. So something to think about. The ink is denser on the Micron, but the Prismacolor has zero bleed. And again, that's probably because it's not as dense. Now this is the one I'm really kind of curious about, the Sharpie pen. I'm used to Sharpie making such alcohol-based materials. Let's see how this hat works. Alright, it looks to me as though the Sharpie has a slight bleed to it, similar to the Micron, but let's let that dry a little bit and that'll be the real test. Let's see how white sits on top of it. Okay, make some thin lines. So, as to be expected, the contrast is a little better because it's slightly darker than the Prismacolor ink, but not as dark as the Micron. Now, as the white dries, it appears to be drying on each of those surfaces perfectly fine. So, let's review again. The Micron, the white has dried wonderfully. You have a, I don't know if the camera even picks it up. Tiny, tiny, tiny little bleed. Now that's with pushing the water into the ink and doing a lot more than I would ever do on top of it. Although I guess if I painted on top of a Micron, that would be something I'd consider. So if we go to the Prismacolor, there's really no bleed at all. The ink isn't as black or dense as the Micron. So maybe if I was going to paint with them over the Micron work, I would just let it dry for a full 24 hours. Maybe that would do it. The white sits really well on top of that ink, but because it's not as dark as the Micron, the contrast isn't as good. I think it's a little harder to see some of the fine line marks in the Prismacolor, but the Micron, those fine lines really pop. I'm hoping the camera captures that well. And the Sharpie's right there in the middle. And again, there is a slight little bleed, like the Micron. The fine lines show up not as good as a Micron, but better than Prismacolor because it's kind of in between the values or the rich black inks. But the white's sitting on top of it just fine. So that's my little test with these new tools. I hope you enjoyed Tool Talk today. And keep your eyes peeled for Inkpulp Instruction coming very, very, very soon. This is the Inkpulp Podcast. This is the Inkpulp Podcast. Comics, hip hop, life.